philosophers are trained to critically examine arguments. And so there are many places where you might think that that doesn't have application, like near-death experiences. Man, like people say they're floating outside their bodies. What does a philosopher have to say about it? Well, turns out, right, like we want to think they had the experience of floating outside their body, right? And on the basis of that experience, they're drawing some inferences about what actually occurred. And that space between the experience and the inference, that's exactly where the philosophical training is valuable as well.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where we're very pleased to welcome Professor Benjamin Mitchell-Yellin. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Sam Houston State University, and his work focuses primarily on ethics, action, racism, as well as death and dying. With John Martin Fisher, he wrote Near-Death Experiences, Understanding Visions of the Afterlife, and he has a variety of journal articles and book chapters. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Mitchell-Yellin.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Awesome. So I want to start with some questions I had about a couple of your papers concerning racism that I found quite interesting. And in there, you've explored what you call a more genealogical view of racism, which is argued to be an improvement on either the primarily like individual moral view and the political institutional view. So racism, at least as it exists now, or in America as well as some other places, should be viewed as involving a drive to dominate, to subjugate, and certain institutions and beliefs arise in a way not separable from each other as the political or moral view might seem to suggest. Is this roughly right? And maybe could you expand a bit on the account?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you've got the basics down pretty nicely. I would say the way I look at it, there's kind of like two key components that would differentiate. Well, maybe three key components that differentiate my view from other ones that might be familiar to people. One is that, on my view, like the phenomenon, you need to look at it in a way that's essentially historical. So what I mean by that is, and that's really the genealogical move. So you can't really understand racism, with like the concept or how it operates in our lives and things like that, without having a historical lens. So if you tried to give like necessary and sufficient conditions for something being racist, I think that's kind of the wrong way of looking at it, partially because of something that you mentioned, which is, and this is like a second part that I think is distinctive in my view, is that it's also essentially pluralistic. So I don't think that psychological states or states of the mind or character traits or something are themselves fundamental. And I also don't think that like institutional structures or policies or norms or something like that are themselves fundamental. I think actually like these are kind of the features that are taken to be fundamental in competing views. I think actually like they're kind of co-fundamental. And so the historical lens invites you to think about how the psychological elements and structural elements develop and are with an interplay over time. Okay, so that's the second kind of distinctive feature. And then the third distinctive feature is this domination point. And the way I have articulated in the past, there's a psychological element, which I call the drive to dominate, but then there's also this kind of structural element, which is, I guess, somewhat cutely, I term it like the dominion of the dominant, but it's basically the idea that like the winner gets to write history, shape institutions, and so on. And so I think that this focus on domination, both as it shows up psychologically in terms of the drive, and as it shows up institutionally and socially in terms of the dominion point, is really important to understanding what's going on. And also I'll say, I think, although I haven't worked this out in nearly the same detail, I think it's also important to understanding the connection between racism and other isms like class oppression, gender oppression, sexual, oppression on the basis of sexual orientation, things like that. So I hope that expands a little bit on your very nice overview.
No, that's great. It's yeah, that definitely explains it, at least somewhat. So like a critic might say though that and some of this you talk about in regards to objections that people might have, but critic might say that you're conflating a sort of frequent cause of racism, like in the institutional or individual sense, with racism itself. So like bringing to light these historical features might, as you say, be important for like understanding how it develops and working against it. But this could still be understood on the maybe more standard views on which on which of racism. So I mean, the history tells us about how it comes about, but not necessarily what it consists in. I mean, does this miss the mark, or what do you think of these sort of criticisms?
Well, this is something I'm trying to think through a bit more now. You're certainly right that there's a sort of criticism that somebody might lob at a view like the one I was just outlining, where they might say, yeah, like what you're talking about, as you put it, right? Like the historical manifestations, that's one thing, but an analysis of the concept, that's a different thing. I actually, I have come to think that that is the wrong way to think about concepts. So there's, and this isn't like new to me, I mean, new from me. So this is kind of in the air in a number of places. So, genealogy is kind of a big topic right now. A lot of people thinking about that. And there's also this kind of like branch of thinking like conceptual engineering or conceptual ethics, where people are sometimes thinking about whether or not we have good reason to continue using the concepts that we have, or having them in the same way. So it's like a forward-looking thing. But then there's also people who think about this in terms of like, analyzing the concepts we do have in genealogical terms. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. So just as a matter of autobiography a little bit, these sort of thoughts really started for me when I was teaching the part of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, where he talks about punishment. And he makes some remarks there that I think that have been influential in my own thinking about this sort of stuff, including about racism, where he's like, look, like punishment, you have these views where like, they say like punishment is justified for deterrent reasons or retributive reasons or whatever, right? And he suggests first that like these rationalizations, they're post hoc. Like what's going on is like you've got these practices that have been a part of human society for a long time. Some of them go way back, some of them get added over time, but you have this like kind of stock of practices. And then like that's one thing. And then, but like the justifications of those practices, those are another. And the basic view that he is suggesting is like, if you want to understand punishment, look into the rationalizations or the justifications that are given is not going to help you understand punishment, because those justifications, that's basically like the people who are in power at the time, like those are the reasons they're giving to rationalize the practices that they're already engaged in and that are serving their various purposes. So really, if you want to understand about punishment, like you got to think about how these practices arose, you know, how these justifications came to be accepted or rejected, or just at least offered, how all this has played together over time, and things like that. And so probably from that description of what Nietzsche was up to, you can see lots of parallels to how I was describing the view of racism that I've trying to defend in various places. So I have a lot of sympathy for that as a way of thinking, at least like certain concepts, maybe not all of them, but maybe all of them. But I think that that's a really good way of understanding these notions. Again, not like a ahistorical or time slice sort of analysis, oftentimes given in terms of like necessary and sufficient conditions, but rather a sort of genealogical or essentially historical analysis that'll talk about how various elements involved in these with these concepts. So in the case of like punishment or racism, various practices and justifications and so on, interests that are served by them, stuff like that. Yeah, right. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, those are some good points. And it's like something you've talked about, that like history, both socially, politically, it's much more complicated than sometimes the simple justifications or stories that we sometimes tell lead on, right? And I mean, maybe part of the idea is that if we just say, oh, our reason for, I don't know, some punishment is this, or at some current time, or racism is this, when we just look at some present time place, for example, we're maybe, it's not just that we're missing out and failing to include some history, it's that the history is relevant to the very notion that we're talking about, and by ignoring that, we're sort of not really understanding the notion itself. Maybe that's one way to put it.
Yeah, or at least yes, I would say, like, by not really understanding the notion, it's first of all, it's not going to be a deep understanding because you're not understanding where this came from. But also, there's a danger of being misled, because if you have the sort of view that, again, and this is that like dominion of the dominant point, if you have the sort of view that I'm sympathetic to, where the narrative, maybe it's historical narrative, maybe it's some other type of narrative, is shaped by those who have the power to shape it, right? Then they're thinking critically and deeply about what's going on will involve questioning whether or not the dominant narrative is accurately representing things. I mean, this is familiar. Historians are super familiar with this sort of thing, right? Like, you can't just accept historical documents on face value, because you got to think like, okay, well, who wrote it, or who produced it, why, what was their position? Could it have served some of their interests, right? Could they have left certain elements of the story out, maybe because it made them look bad and things like that? And this is, by the way, is going to be like right on topic for discussions of racism anyway. Just to give like a pretty easy example, in the United States, like discussion of the institution of slavery has historically, I mean, or at least like the story that we get nowadays, for various reasons, has whitewashed it, in the sense that like a lot of the elements of extreme brutality and inhumanity and stuff just are not passed down, right? And you can see why, and you can trace like some of the, historians do a good job of tracing the causes of these omissions or the causes of these like reinterpretations of what's going on and challenging them. I think that philosophers can learn a lot from historians in thinking in this way.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as well, in at least one of those papers, you mentioned, actually, you've also mentioned here that this approach isn't meant to give like a list of necessary and sufficient criteria.
Mhm.
I mean, this is potentially a weakness because it doesn't give us like clear like application conditions
Yeah.
apart from, yeah. And it doesn't support the generalizations about racism for a lot of counterfactual or perhaps even novel scenarios.
Mhm.
This is a potential weakness, though. I mean, is it not too serious for you, or what do you think about someone who's concerned about these ways of thinking about it?
Yeah, well, I think on the one hand, I think there's maybe like some methodological issues in the background. And that is a can of worms that I can't quite unpack, even like in my own thinking, let alone like articulate right now, but it's stuff that I'm thinking about. And I think I already hinted at some of it when I was talking about like the conceptual engineering literature and things like that. And genealogy more broadly. But in terms of like just, a criticism of the account of racism that I defend. So one thing is it more difficult to identify novel cases on the view that I offer versus other views? I don't actually think that it is. In fact, I think that I kind of turn the criticism on its head a bit and say that actually I think there's some advantages for my view in this regard. The reason being that because if you're focused, if you're rooted in the historical interplay of these elements, again, like psychological and institutional or structural roughly, then you might be live to, you can use these like the way things have developed in the past as clues to how they might develop in the future. Now, there's a sense of novel in which like that's not going to help you. But I think that there's a second element in my view that helps in this regard. And that's like, if you're thinking about the domination point. So when you start to recognize domination in certain regards or things that look like precursors to domination, that might send up red flags that like, hey, things are moving in a direction, a particular direction here, right? So maybe we don't have yet something that would officially qualify as like a racist institution or racist policy or racist action or individual or something like that. But it's given what we know about the past and what things appear to look like right now, we should kind of be on the lookout for this developing into something that would be recognizable on the view as satisfying the account of racism, again, institutional or personal or whatever. So I think actually that's a feature of the view, not a bug all the time. But again, I can see, this goes back to the competing methodological considerations point. Like there are some people who think that that's just not really the way that you give a philosophical account. And just the final thing I'll say, and I say this in terms of like the pragmatic aim in the paper, like I think that the sort of view that I offer has some advantages in helping us think about anti-racist efforts. So efforts to identify and combat, or at least mitigate the harms of racism. And I think that my view will be more helpful in this regard for various reasons than some of the competing views. In part because of the pluralism, but also in part because of the sort of historicality that I was just talking about.
Yeah, that's some fair points. Yeah. I mean, either way, whether we think that it's historicality is like essential to racism, understanding the history is going to be useful for combating it and so forth. I did want to on the just on that previous point though, like on cases that on novel cases that might not be handled well. Like I was thinking, like suppose there were, you know, some people, some person or group somewhere where there isn't the sort of requisite history, sort of structures that we think are racist or develop or lead to these sort of racist beliefs and structures. Someone could still like maybe quickly develop a, something that we might reasonably call racist. I mean, these things could and probably do happen. Is that, but without this sort of history and this like maybe this like dominance narrative, is it? I mean, is the view equipped to sort of handle that and classify that as racist? Kind of see where I'm getting what I'm getting at here.
Maybe it can't. So are you thinking? Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by quickly develop. And also it depends a little bit on like what you're imagining. Like, are you imagining like some social group here of human beings here on Earth that is somehow untouched by the sorts of structure? I mean, I'm not so sure that it's I'm not so sure that it's a realistic example, I guess, is one response. But another response is that just to echo what I already said, like I think that the understanding how things have developed in the past in places where it's pretty clear that we have racist people or institutions, that will help kind of give a framework for thinking about what may appear to be novel circumstances. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's not even, so we don't have to think of the racism in these cases as involving its own, necessarily involving its own sort of similar historical context, but we can make emphasis about it because of other histories and so forth. Is that part of the idea?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so I mean, you alluded at the beginning of the discussion to like, you know, racism in the American context and stuff. And so I certainly don't think that racism is going to have the same history everywhere, right? So there's going to be particular differences. So, you know, the American context is going to have its own particular history. Obviously, it is connected to other parts of the globe, right? And I do think it would be a mistake to think that these different parts of the globe are totally disconnected from each other. I also think that another reason to think that my view would have kind of a broader application than just, for example, the American context would be, so it does posit a psychological element that at least provisionally I'm thinking of as widespread, if not universal, and that's the drive to dominate, right? So I'm not sure exactly what I think about that, to be honest. Like, do I think that that's like a universal feature of human psychology? There's some reasons I think to think maybe. There's also some reasons to think maybe not. But even this, I think, is going to be saddled with some issues about history, right? Like how you think about universality, right? I mean, it could be that we have, as a matter of fact, developed in such a way that we exhibit this drive. I also think that there are empirical theories that suggest that, you know, so social dominance theory suggests that drive to dominate is like, or this social dominance orientation, as they call it, like is pretty widespread. It'll be stronger in some groups than other groups, and it's subject to certain like social influences and things like that. Certainly there are thinkers, Plato, Nietzsche, who suggested that these sorts of in Plato's desire to outdo others, or in Nietzsche, right, this will to power, they seem to suggest that they're like universal or widespread, like they're just a feature of our psychologies. So these are some of like the influences on my thinking. But then there are people who think, like, I mean, I'm open to the possibility that you could have humans, even a human society where people don't exhibit this drive. Now, I will say that one thing that I think that I'm interested in exploring is, one reason I talk about a drive to dominate, right? Not rather than, for example, a desire, is that view of drives that I like differentiates them. So it distinguishes between the aim of the drive and the object of the drive. So the aim of the drive would be domination in this case, but that might be satisfied in relation to various objects. And this, I think, is a very intriguing thought in this context, because go back to this pragmatic aim, like how do you identify, combat, mitigate racism? Right. Well, maybe one possibility, if you are thinking in terms of this drive to dominate, is to rechannel, not sublimate the drive, right? Not repress it, but like rechannel it. Like maybe, rather than it finding expression with racialized targets, this drive could find expression in some other ways. So that, I think, is a possibility I'd like to explore in the future. But how widespread this drive would be is also, I think, in my own mind, an open question.
Interesting, right? So part of the idea there is that the drive itself isn't like necessarily aimed at, I don't know, like the subjugation or dominance of particular racial groups.
Oh, no. Yeah.
And so, I mean, if you want to put it this way, that same drive could be repurposed for something more less harmful, and so forth.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's like, even if you took like the most racist individual you could find, it's not like their drive to dominate is always targeting only racialized objects. I mean, I think that, so I hinted earlier at like, thinking that my view has some connections to other isms, like, right, like classism or sexism, things like that. So part of the way that I think about that potential connection is, well, those would be cases where the drive to dominate would take like a different object, an object that is not racialized, right? Objects picked out because of its sex or gender or something like that, or its class. And so, and also I should say that there are views of how race has developed in this country where, they explicitly bring together the interplay of class and race dynamics, right? And so I've been influenced by that sort of thinking as well.
Right. And you also talk about, although briefly in at least one of those papers, I don't recall if it comes up in the other one, about how the relevance to sort of current political events like the election of Donald Trump and of Jeff Sessions, and yeah, I don't know. I guess I was wondering what the significance of these events you think is for thinking about racism, and I don't know, maybe if you wanted to comment on, yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of significance. At the time that I was writing the stuff that you read on racism, or especially when I was initially thinking about it, it was like post 2016 presidential election in the US. And so Trump was elected. There was a lot of discussion about why, especially given that he ran on a platform that was meant to appeal to many things, but among them, right, racial animosity. And this became, I mean, in the empirical literature that I've seen a lot of predictors, a significant predictor of support of Trump even still is people's views about racial hierarchy, right? So if people who are more likely to endorse claims about like different capabilities of members of different racial groups and things like that are more likely to support Donald Trump as a politician, right? That's what I mean. So I do think that there's a lot. I do think that those political events are connected to what's going on, not just as a matter of like how I came to be thinking about these issues, but as a matter of like what's going on. Also, another thing that I've been interested in that regard is like the normalization of words and behavior that exhibit racial antipathy in particular. So very good example of what I mean by this is like when COVID started to break out and President Trump, because he was president at the time, would tweet about, you know, the Kung flu or the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or something like that. Like there's fairly robust correlation between this and upticks in anti-Asian attacks, again, in word and deed, right? So that's another element of what's going on. Like you get, so in other words, I guess what I'm saying is like you get on the one side, you can, okay, well, how do we explain the electoral success of Trump? And then on the other hand, you get like, well, how do we explain, like, how does that success in that position of power and privilege explain other things that are going on in the society around the same time? I mean, I don't want to suggest that like Trump is the cause of all evil or anything. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, I think that there's a lot of underlying things that were in place to allow him to have electoral success, right? So it's not all the blame falls on his shoulders, but then there are also things that he did, in some ways continues to do in public spaces that has ramifications that are also relevant to the topic. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I've heard people comment that in a way, the success of Trump and some of the events that have transpired have made more transparent sort of existing racial attitudes and structures. And to that extent, and the extent that it's like it become more apparent, we can that'll often lead to more of a conversation about it. That might be beneficial, but it's also, as you say, led in some ways to normalizations of certain problematic behaviors, and maybe the development and strengthening of certain attitudes. So yeah, it's a lot of things to navigate there.
I mean, I will say in terms of like the it's interesting if you in terms of like, hey, did Trump's electoral success how'd you put it, like made more apparent problems? I mean, I think that actually really depends on who you talk to. I think that there are many people in the US and elsewhere for whom this was not a surprise at all, right? Because their lived experience is such that they have been facing these issues all their lives, and it's been pretty much in their face and they can't avoid it, right? And then there's other people, and I think I would fit more in this second category, right? For whom Trump's electoral success was a real wake-up call. And that's because in a lot of ways, like my lived experience is not one where these issues are thrown in my face on a regular basis. Or at least I can avoid them about much more easily. And so I think it's been really interesting to read and talk about stuff in the past several years, because you have, I think, like an instance of very like divergent life experiences where for some people they were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that our country supports this. And other people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you can't believe that our country supports this. Like, it's been obviously doing it for so long. And so again, like I'll just say that this sort of like recognizing the sort of divergence in reactions to Trump's election was part of what motivates me to think that like the historical lens is just absolutely essential. Because those people who have a lived history, right, of these issues, like they're or people who have been studying and reading and talking about this for a long time, like they just tended to be much less surprised about this. So anyway, I got a real education in reading around and talking to people and encountering figures and ideas that I just hadn't been introduced to beforehand. So I've learned a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all great. And you sort of reiterated there that the historical perspective might enable us to make these sort of predictions that
Yes.
otherwise might elude us given our just lived experiences and so forth.
That's exactly right. And I should say that like, it's not like these views weren't out there, but they weren't like mainstreamed in the right sort of way. And then that goes back to this idea also of, you know, who gets to write the narrative and steer the discussion and things like that. And so there are a lot of people with a lot of really important stuff to say, but they just don't have the soapbox to say it loudly and to get as wide an audience as the ideas really deserve, I think.
Fair enough. So I wanted to move on to another topic. And I initially came across some of your work that you've done in collaboration with John Martin Fisher on near-death experiences and immortality, and the latest stuff. And so I found the paper called "The Near-Death Experience Argument Against Physicalism: A Critique." To be very interesting. So that the paper contains, as I see it, like two main points. One is that the inference from, or inferences that we might make from near-death experiences to the falsehood of physicalism about mind is fairly weak. And two, that non-physicalist models themselves have a variety of issues, perhaps more than they allegedly solve regarding NDEs. I mean, is this a sort of fair overview of the structure of the paper and what's going on in that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the paper and then the book to some degree too, since it expands on that paper. Like, yeah, it's really the first part. Yeah, so these arguments against physicalism on the basis of NDEs are, as a matter of like both substance and form, not very good. They fall apart under careful scrutiny pretty quickly. So that's part of what we're trying to demonstrate in the paper. But then the second thing that you mentioned, I think it's really important also to see that like a lot of times what's motivating people is that they want an explanation for this stuff. Maybe they have had such an experience themselves. So like, you know, maybe they're one of the roughly 1 in 5 people who have a heart attack and have some sort of near-death experience. Like they have the experience of floating above their body while they're receiving CPR, or their life flashes before their eyes, like a movie, or they, you know, float through, you know, a tunnel towards the light, or they have the experience of visiting deceased relatives in heaven or something like that, right? So like these are subjects, these are like common elements in near-death experiences. So maybe, these subjects, for their experience of what's going on suggests that like this is reality, right? And it's but part of the second part is pointing out, well, okay, like this might seem like a very simple way to explain what's going on, right? Like, your soul popped out of the top of your head and floated near the ceiling and watched your body getting pumped by the medical experts and whatever, medical team and whatnot. And that might seem like a really simple explanation, right? Okay, like that's all we need. You got a body and a soul, and they came apart, and you were with your soul, and then it popped back in, and like now we understand what happened. But part of the second point that you articulate is, well, like it seems like a simple explanation, but the problem is it now shifts the explanatory burden to a whole bunch of other questions. Like, okay, well, when your soul is embodied, like how does it interact with this meat such that you can walk around living and having these sorts of experiences that we're used to having all the time, like these non-special and non-near-death experiences. So I think that's an important part, especially since now bringing the two ideas together, like a number of the arguments for what we call supernaturalism on the basis of NDEs will invoke something like parsimony, explanatory usefulness of notion of like an immaterial consciousness or something like that. And so the 2 points kind of work together, because it's like, well, first of all, the arguments, they make some argumentative leaps of faith, and that's part of the reason that they fall apart. But also, like, some of the principles that are being invoked in the context of these arguments actually don't look like they bear out. So the simplicity idea just doesn't look true.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, like on that, I feel that like how one understands the NDE data will depend, or like the sort of conclusions they draw from it will depend at least in part on some of their antecedent views. So like if you're already fairly confident that minds are physical, for example, then some reports, which might seem to count against that even weakly, would do little to undermine the overall view. So we'd say there's a variety of possible physical explanations, even aside from the possibility that the experiences are occurred, that, they occur at other times than perhaps believed, like not during cardiac arrest, but maybe coming in or out of consciousness. They were mistakenly believed to have happened. Was that notion of doxastic hallucination or something? Maybe the reports were exaggerated, fraudulent. There were some reports that are just maybe accidentally correct. Sometimes, someone reports something being put in a drawer. Well, maybe they just got lucky. Maybe these things happen all the time, and sometimes people are correct. And the point being that if we're weighing which is more likely true, there's all these, in each case, something like one of these options occurred, or well, minds are really this other sort of substance or something like that. Someone who's already fairly confident in the ladders against that the ladder's false is not going to be moved in this way. I mean, does this seem right to you? Like,
well, I think it's absolutely true as like a fact about how people engage with this stuff. That's absolutely true. I mean, here's one way to think about what's going on in terms of like John Fisher and my kind of intervention in the literature. Okay, so, and this I think really, this may be a source of frustration for people who think that NDEs support supernaturalism. Okay, so but here's the thing, like dialectically, we are in a better position, and here's why. Because while it's true that if you are antecedently a physicalist, you might not be convinced that near-death experiences show physicalism to be false, right? The thing is the people who we are engaging with, they doesn't matter what they think antecedently, right? Are they physicalists or supernaturalists, right? But their argumentative aim is to prove, oftentimes they put it in terms of this: NDEs prove that physicalism's false, right? Now, some other people are a bit more careful, and they'll say like NDEs should like raise our credence in the falsity of physicalism, right? Or they should at least like open our minds up to the possibility that physicalism's false, okay? So there are people who are much carefuler, right? Much more careful, but then there are plenty of people who go for the proof, right? And so in terms of the people who go for the proof, like dialectically, they're in a weaker position because they've got a lot more to show. And so doesn't matter antecedently, like whether or not you think physicalism is true, just like as a matter of what they're aiming to show, like it's a much like stronger conclusion and thereby a weaker argument because it's easier to pick apart. So that's one thing that I'll say about like kind of the shape of the dialectic. And I think that might explain some of what's going on in terms of like people digging their heels into their kind of what they already thought was true, which again, I think is like a genuine phenomenon. I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. You know, I try not to be, but we all do that. We're all more sympathetic to positions we already hold to be true than to things that would show that what we believe is false. I mean, it's just a feature of how our minds work.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And that distinction between the stronger argument, like, oh, this just rules out physicalism, and the weaker one, which is, it's, you know, it's at least part of a case against it, even if it doesn't prove it's false, is important. And I think it's like Pim van Lommel's work, you talk about that he does seem to be committed to that sort of stronger argument, and maybe there's others too.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I was going to mention, but I didn't, but I'll mention it now, which is that, so there's also another thing going on, which is that, so someone like Pim van Lommel, he's a cardiologist, right? So he's a medical doctor. His expertise are going to be different than someone like myself or John Fisher. We're philosophers. Now, one reaction that I often get to this work is, well, like as a philosopher, you shouldn't even be weighing in on this stuff because you're not doing any studies. You're not like collecting any data, right? I'm not even like an expert in human physiology or anything like that, right? So people think that, look, I am not credentialed to talk about these issues. And I think in one respect, that's fair. Like I'm not credentialed to talk about, and I don't have that relevant expertise to talk about very specific things about like how the brain functions and things like that. Okay. But the thing is that's not the thing that we're trying to talk about. What John and I are trying to talk about is like, look, you have somebody like Pim van Lommel who is an expert in various things, but he is himself going outside his area of expertise to make metaphysical claims and philosophical arguments on the basis of the data that he's collected. Now, he's done some really interesting studies, and the data that he's collected is, I think, valuable and fascinating. That's not what I'm like disputing at all. But what I'm disputing is like, okay, the arguments on the basis of that data for metaphysical conclusions, like that physicalism is false, or that we have reason to doubt its truth, depending on if you want to go with the stronger or the weaker claim. And that sort of stuff is exactly the stuff that philosophers are trained to think about, right? Now, we don't always get it right, but like that's certainly our wheelhouse. And so I think it like one source of frustration with that people have, and it, like if you went to look at the Amazon comments on the book, for example, you get this all the time. You know, like, hey, who are these guys to write about this, right? They haven't even done any studies. And it's like, no, we haven't, but like, that's not the point that we're trying to make, right? We're trying to say like, hey, take these studies that are very interesting, right? Assume that they're true. Now think about the philosophical or metaphysical conclusions that people are drawing on the basis of these studies, and those are what's problematic, right? So again, that's another like feature of the dialectic that I think has shaped the kind of the project, but also its reception.
Yeah. I mean, we should definitely think about these things as interdisciplinary in a way. Like, okay, so we're definitely there's some area room for the work in psychology and sort of scientific research and stuff like this, but we're trying to draw conclusions about it, and we're trying to make arguments, and this is going to involve stuff like philosophy of mind and reasoning that's more in the wheelhouse of a philosopher. So I mean, it might bring in people of the relevant expertise. That seems to be the right way to approach these difficult topics.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's not just on near-death experiences, but a range, broad range of topics. This is exactly the sort of interdisciplinary collaboration that you're describing, and I think is precisely the right way to do it. I mean, just going back to the racism stuff like that, that's part of what's going on in my thinking about that, right? I mentioned history quite a bit, but there's other disciplines as well, sociology, anthropology, and so on, right? Where, look, people are doing really good work in these areas, right? So as philosophers, I mean, part of what one way of glossing what I was saying back in that part of the conversation, like as philosophers, you should really want to pay attention to this and incorporate it into your thinking, right? Now, in the context of the near-death experience stuff that we're talking about right now, I think that part of what's going on is like, one way of looking at the point I was trying to make is like, yeah, there's room for experts in a range of different fields to be thinking about this same topic. And also there's a danger that people who aren't appealing to relevant expertise, but are wanting to draw conclusions on the basis of things that they are experts in might overreach their, like stretch themselves beyond their comfort zone. And people might come in and point out that, hey, that's actually not the way to go about this.
Yeah, and more on some of the data concerning near-death experiences. From my understanding, it seems to me that the sort of data that might be used against physicalism is like much weaker than what we might expect on the non-physical or supernatural view. So, especially concerning the like controlled data testing for out-of-body experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Well, fun is really limited. I mean, it's certainly there's room for continued exploration on that. But to my knowledge, it hasn't really produced the sort of results we'd expect if people were genuinely having out-of-body experiences. Like if someone was really floating above their body in the operating room, they should be able to see something like, say, on a top of a shelf that wouldn't have been visible from, and they wouldn't have been able to know was there otherwise. But that's where the results like that. I mean, we don't seem to have that, at least to my knowledge. I mean, what do you think about this and as a potential limitation to the non-physical supernaturalist view?
Well, yeah, I basically agree with what you're saying. I mean, so you're talking about, so like Van Lommel mentions these sorts of studies in the past, and there have been people like Sam Parnia who have run more recent studies that are intended to gather the same type of results. And so I'm very sympathetic to the basic thing that you said, which was, look, if people are really like floating as disembodied consciousnesses outside their bodies, but while watching what's actually happening to their body at the time, we should be able to get some hits on these studies that are trying to, so place cards up near the ceiling and then ask people, did you have an experience while you were, in cardiac arrest or whatever? Oh, you did. So some subset of them will have one. Oh, you did. Well, what did you see? And then like the card never shows up, or in the Parnia example, like they wheel like a tablet that would then kind of be facing up near the head. Because Van Lommel says, well, hey, no wonder they didn't see the cards, because like their own face is much more interesting. So because like the inattentional blindness is that like they wouldn't see the card because there's something that they're more attuned to, namely their own lifeless body that would be taking up all their attention. And then so somebody like Parnia says, well, okay, well, what if we move the image closer to the body? Again, no hits on this sort of thing. So yes, I do have some sympathy for the idea that, look, like if this phenomenon were as it seems to many people, then these sorts of experiments should produce some positive results, but they haven't. So that gives us some reason to think that these out-of-body experiences are not what they seem to be. On the other hand, like, are you ever going to be able to totally rule this out? No. And then, I mean, I don't really see how you're going to do that. So, and you do have these other cases, like the dentures case that you alluded to with the dentures in the drawer, or the Pam Reynolds case, which I find totally fascinating. Like these are cases where you have what's called like apparently veridical perception, right? So content of an experience that matches what was actually happening at the time. So the guy reports having seen the nurse take his dentures out, right, and put them in the drawer. The dentures are missing. A couple of days later, sees the nurse, says, oh yeah, you know where they are. They're in that drawer where you took them out. So like he's reporting an experience that contains in the report description of events that actually occurred at a time when you'd be like, wow, how could you possibly have seen this? Because you were receiving CPR, you weren't conscious at the time. And he said, well, because I was floating above my body and I saw you do it. So you have apparently veridical perception. So there are some cases where you get, they're really striking for this reason. I think they are absolutely the best challenge to physicalism on the basis of near-death experiences that I know of. But then, of course, like you get, so first of all, like, are there other ways of explaining how we can know this? You hinted at one earlier, right? This sort of stuff happens all the time, and he kind of like imported this general understanding into his memory of what occurred or something like that. Maybe that explanation isn't totally satisfactory, but neither is the explanation that he was actually a disembodied consciousness. So kind of we have to think about it in a more holistic way. And then that's where that second feature of the paper, supernaturalism doesn't actually offer a simpler explanation, would come in. It was like, okay, on the holistic view, maybe these physical or physicalist friendly explanations really are the way to go because they come with less overall baggage or something like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's something you explore there, and I think add more depth in that book as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although I haven't gotten a chance to look at that yet. Of course, as you say, near-death experiences are real events. They occur. We don't. This isn't to diminish either their reality or the research that's being done on those. I mean, that's still valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would say, like, if there's anything that is like bedrock to that project, it's, as a nice philosopher, making a distinction, right? So a distinction between two senses are real, right? So sometimes people will say, oh, well, you're saying that near-death experiences aren't real. What John and I try to explain is, like, look, there's two senses are real. Like, did the person really have this experience? And did the experience, the content of the experience, correspond to reality? And there's two different, and we are not trying to deny the reality of these experiences in the first sense. So we're saying, like, look, Abe and Alexander, hey, you really did, like, we're willing to take your word that you really did have this experience. Now, there are other people who have cast doubt on the veracity of Abe and Alexander's report of his NDE, but that's not what we're trying to do. right? And then similarly for other cases, like, hey, look, like willing to grant like this, you actually had this experience and it's really fascinating. And it may have had, and this is now alluding to some other work of Pim van Lomo's about the transformative effects of these experiences. Like, hey, they really do impact people's lives, oftentimes in a very positive way. Okay. Make them more pro-social, more like less afraid of death, interested in all sorts of things, right? That are positive transformations. Like we're not trying to explain those away either. That really has an impact, right? But that doesn't mean that what you experienced matches reality, right? And there's all sorts of other phenomena that we're aware of that has the same thing, you know, dreams or hallucinations or psychedelic trips and things like that. Like they're going to share these features. Like people are having these experiences, but they don't correspond to reality in the normal way, right? But they can profoundly transform them. So, and also, by the way, they are explainable in physicalist friendly terms. So, you know, maybe it's worth exploring and taking seriously that the same is true about NDEs.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and having the like interesting experiences that have these transformative effects is common, not just in NDEs and stuff, but elsewhere. Like people talk about religious experiences and spiritual experiences, and you know, of course, the skeptic can grant the reality of the experiences, but maybe doubt some of the more supernatural conclusions drawn concerning them. I mean, yes, experiences can be very psychologically impactful, but that doesn't necessarily require a supernatural or some metaphysical conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would sum up the point by saying like, there's the issue of the experience and then the interpretation of that experience. We're not really trying to weigh in on the experience part, right? Take that for granted. The kind of philosophically meaty issues about interpretation of it, right? Do they prove that heaven's for real, or do they show us that consciousness is immaterial or something like that? And again, these are claims, sometimes titles of books that people make, right? And so that's really what we're trying to weigh in on, not whether or not people are telling the truth, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. Although in that one case, didn't it turn out that the heaven is for real was a made-up story, or was that the other one I'm thinking of? One of those.
Well,
yeah.
So there was. Sometimes the universe is a crazy place. So there was a kid named Malarkey. His last name was Malarkey, who did seems like from various reports, like under pressure of his father, like did kind of report having had as a child a near-death experience and things like that, very similar to the one that Colton Burpo, again through his father, reports in Heaven is for Real. But in the Malarkey case, it was malarkey. But that doesn't mean that like, I don't know what to think about Colton Burpo. You know, he was like 3-4 years old when he had this experience. And I mean, that sort of case is going to be different than someone like Eben Alexander. And I was alluding to earlier that even Eben Alexander, people have tried to cast doubt on the veracity of his report. So there was an Esquire article by Luke Dietrich that talked about this and basically kind of tried to make the case that maybe Eben Alexander has a history of fabricating details that has gotten him in trouble in the past, like losing his medical license and things like that, or at least like operating privileges and things. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. I was saying, like, there are definitely people who want to deny the reality of the experiences in that first sense of real. But again, that's not what John and I were trying to do. I mean, I guess I would say, like, that's not really a fight. That's not the fight that I'm trying to pick, right? Like, what I'm totally willing to grant that and say, I mean, not that I think everybody always tells the truth all the time. I mean, sure, there are some incentives to telling a story, you know, some of them financial, to telling a story, getting a book contract, like, that's all real. And I'm not trying to just like give everyone a pass, but that's not the kind of point we're trying to make. Point we're trying to make is like, look, even if you grant that these people are all telling the truth and this stuff really happened to them, the interpretation of what it means for our understanding of reality and ourselves is not what many people are claiming it is.
Right. Yeah. That's a sort of common philosophical approach, which is to say, look, let's just grant all of this. The argument still is not successful. It's still pretty weak. And of course, someone is free to doubt some of the stuff that was granted, but you don't have to get into a discussion about that to show the problems with the argument.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to another topic, which has to do with immortality, the various forms of immortality, and boredom. So yeah, and like, you've pushed back against the intuition and arguments that what we might call a robustly immortal individual will necessarily develop some boredom or motivational boredom or something like that. And then the thought is on that sort of view that, well, if someone is really living forever, then eventually they'll run out of things to do, or things which generate pleasure or otherwise motivate them to keep living. And I think you rightly point out that this doesn't have to be the case. I mean, maybe someone just, I mean, there's infinitely many things that someone could do, or maybe they do continue to have the sort of pleasures necessary to, or whatever is necessary for them to be motivated to keep living and so forth. And if the thesis itself is like very strong, like, oh, necessarily everyone will generate this sort of boredom in eternity. I mean, is this could you expand a bit on the view, and also sort of as a follow-up, how reliable do you think our reasoning is about the experiences that are in some ways so foreign to us now? Like, for example, the experience of a 10 to the 100-year-old person.
Let me take the second question first.
Sure.
I do think that we should be wary of drawing conclusions about what would be the case in an immortal life, whether that means like much longer, but not forever, or especially if that means forever, right? We should be wary of drawing conclusions about that on the basis of our lived experience as mortals, or at least as people who understand themselves as mortals. Roughly the idea is like, look, I mean, here's one reason that one thought that goes in this vein, which is like, hey, we plan out our lives to more or less, right? Think about careers and relationships and things, but with this implicit understanding that we'll live, a few decades, maybe a century, right? And that really structures the way we think about it, think about our lives, and kind of plan and expect things. But if that's and everybody's doing that, right? So if that's like what we're used to, then we shouldn't be super confident in extrapolating from that to what we would be like and how we would think if our expectations or our reality were way different, right? So one example I use in class with my students when we talk about this stuff is I'm like, well, if you could expect to live 1,000 years, would you go to college at 18? Okay, and a lot of them say no. why would I do that? Right? Like there's some other stuff that I would want to do first. And, I would have a lot of time later. Or as a follow-up, I say, well, like, if you could expect, suppose you went, so for those who say, yeah, I'd still go at 18. I say, well, like, you're choosing your major and whatnot. Like, would you think about that, whatever career that's going to lead to as like your career for life? And some of them say, well, no, maybe I think it was like my first career or something like that. So it's just, these are ways of illustrating that like our thinking would likely be really different in the context of immortality than our current situation. So that's part of my response to your second question. The argument, like the view in the first question, like would immortality be necessarily boring? So kind of the most influential discussion of this in the contemporary literature is Bernard Williams on the basis of the Macropolis case. So a case from an opera from a play where Elena Macropolis, or alias EM, she takes this elixir, has her live for 300 years, and then she eventually decides not to take it again. But in the intervening time, like, she's been 37 or 42, depending on how you want to do the years, biologically for 300 years now. And as William tells it, like she's totally disengaged from life. It leaves her cold. She's detached. This is the sense of boredom he has in mind. It's like this existential boredom. You got nothing to live for. Okay. It's not like twiddle your thumbs boredom, like, man, there's nothing on Netflix right now. So it's not that, because it's a type of boredom that he thinks that you can't snap out of. The reason is because like there's no basis on which you could snap out of it. That's William's view. So like you've lost all basis for interest in life. Okay, so that's a sort of boredom. Now, the argument against it is, well, first of all, seems like we can come up with some things that might maintain our interest for a long time. Maybe not always, right? But like things that we could, not always in a sense that like every instance it's interesting, but it could regain its interest after some intervening time, right? So think like one example that we've talked about in places is like, well, so people say like, hey, once you read all the great novels, you'd be bored. Got nothing more to read. Well, it's not really clear that's true, because like, why not go back to some of the ones that you read earlier on? And now that you've read all these other books in the meantime, like maybe you'll have a fresh set of eyes when you read this first one again. Because there'll be other stuff now in your kind of background experience that you can bring to your reading of this novel. So it would be, so what's old is new again. Like, why not think that that could apply, even if you have, and then there's a second reason, which is like, why would you think that there wouldn't be any new novels written? Right. Yeah. So in the time that it takes you to read all the great novels, some new great novels will be written. And then like in that time, some more new great novels. So like, why would you think that it would get exhausted? That's another reason to think it might maintain your interest, at least for a really long time, if not indefinitely. So these are some of the considerations that we give to think that necessarily it's not the case that everyone would be bored. It might depend on what your interests are.
Right. And on that, it seems to me that like it might depend in part on what our memory is like as well. Since like after I read, suppose I read 1 million books, and I come back, say after thousands of years, to some of the books I read at the beginning, I might not even remember that I read that book. And in a sense,
that's right.
And if this sort of recycling of material or of experiences or of activities and so on can be done like that indefinitely, or at least for a very long time, that at least seems to undercut the necessary boredom thesis.
Yeah, actually, so there's a guy, Eric Schwartz-Gable, who talks about fishbowl immortality. And so that's related to what you're saying. Yeah, like if you would forget experiences, then yeah, what's old may be new again simply because you forgot that it's old. And so I think that's definitely one consideration that also speaks against this necessary boredom thesis. And so that I think that's a good one.
Right. I was also thinking though that, like, on the other hand, even if the necessary boredom thesis is false, which I mean it seems to be so, there might still be good reasons to disprefer the sort of robust immortality, i.e. the sort from which there's no escape. So like for me, when I'm thinking about it, if there's some reasonable concern that my continuing to live will be undesirable from some point forward, or I don't know, maybe there'll be recurring stretches of significant stretches where it's undesirable. I feel like this is a risk not worth taking. I mean, do you think this is reasonable? What do you think about this option if you were to face it, I guess?
So like what sort of thing do you have in mind?
Of sort of so if you were given the option to have a sort of robust immortality from which you could never cease to exist. I mean, I guess the question is, well, is it like a heaven experience, or is it something else? Like, I mean, is that the sort of question? Because I'm maybe.
So when you talked about risk, do you mean like the risk of making this choice and then regretting it later, sort of thing?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that's, I mean, let me say one like prefatory thing, like, what's interesting about this is that this seems to me so a lot of times when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about it from like a secular perspective, but this is directly relevant to lots of theological considerations, right? Like how could heaven be a paradise, right? If there's this risk of, say, boredom or something that comes with true immortality. So that I think that's interesting. I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's a source of interesting connection between discussions of these issues that start from very different places. They come together at a certain point. But do I think that there's this sort of risky? I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, well, first non-prefatory thing that I'll say is that on like a practical level, I think that it's more important to think about what in the papers and stuff talked about as medical immortality, or, goes under the guise of life extension. Because look, like true immortality just doesn't seem like something that we could achieve for ourselves. I mean, we can extend our lifespans. We may even be able to radically extend our lifespans and things like that, or even like super radically, but like true, like invulnerability to death doesn't seem like something that we can achieve for ourselves. Okay, so absent certain theological commitments, it doesn't seem like that's kind of the question that we should be asking about. So then when you ask about like a risk to making the choice to opt for true immortality, on the one hand, I think like it's an interesting puzzle, but it's not like a very practically relevant question. So I'll just say that. But let me put that to the side because you asked the question anyway, so I should probably answer it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that there are risks. Just because I don't think that immortality would necessarily be boring doesn't mean that I don't think that it could be boring, right? Just like people get bored in their everyday lives, or just like mortal individuals feel like they might be better off dead. I don't see why that couldn't happen to immortal individuals, right? I mean, again, going back to this kind of like stronger and weaker claims and dialectical positioning that we were talking about earlier, like the necessary boredom thesis, the claim that necessarily, if you lived long enough, you would become bored. That's a super strong claim, right? And all it takes to show that that's false is to come up with one case where that's not true, right? But just because you think the necessary boredom thesis is false doesn't mean that you think that immortality is all honky-dory for everybody all the time. So I guess my to summarize the answer would be like, well, I mean, I don't see why we would think that you couldn't become bored or disillusioned with an immortal life, given especially that we know that people become bored and disillusioned with their mortal lives. Does that help answer what you were talking about?
Yeah, for sure. It is, I don't know, it's something maybe we're just worth thinking about, if only because it's a somewhat common view that, but you're right to point out that, especially for those without those sort of theological commitments, the medical sense of extending human life, perhaps radically, is relevant. I mean, these are the sort of questions that we might want to ask both politically and morally. And that was, I previously talked with Professor Larry Temkin, and he has a although we talked about his upcoming book on something else, but he has a paper exploring some of those, called This Living Longer Better, where he explores some of those. Now, he doesn't draw any particularly strong conclusions in there, but yeah, I think it's stuff worth thinking about in any case.
Yeah, I should add that I have so recently been thinking about some of this stuff through a slightly different lens, which is that I actually think, so far been talking about, arguments against the necessary boredom thesis that roughly go like, well, maybe there are certain sorts of projects or desires or something that could sustain you indefinitely. But actually, the background of that is this idea, like I was saying earlier from Williams, that like, elements of your psychology might kind of fail to continue to give you reason to continue living if you live too long. But actually, I've come to think that is that's maybe not the most pressing issue when you're thinking about these things. And so part of what I started thinking about is actually, I think it's actually better to think in terms of what you value rather than what you desire. So this is related to projects and papers that you said you didn't read, but that's okay. So put that aside. I can talk more about why I think that if you'd like, but to the present point, like once you adopt the idea that we should think about reasons, values, as opposed to desires as giving you reason to continue living, is that now, like, what the world has to offer in the future will make a much bigger impact on whether or not your life at that future time is still meaningful or worth living. And so what do I mean by that is like, so the basic idea is this, like, it makes sense to desire or want something that doesn't exist, like maybe you go invent it or something like that. But it doesn't make sense to value something that doesn't exist, because valuing involves, for example, like emotional attunement to the welfare of the valued object. Like, how's it doing, right? If it gets damaged, you feel bad or sad, right? If it's thriving, you feel good. That's true for like a relationship. It's true for objects and so on. Okay. So when you start to think about things in terms of values, like if something that you value disappears or is no longer there to be engaged with and tracked emotionally and cared about, then it doesn't make sense to value it. And so if your values give you reason to continue living, actually, like, stuff like climate change is going to be a huge threat to the reasonableness or desirability of immortal life, because like it's going to really change like the sorts of things that we can do. So just take an example, like if you really enjoy spending daytime outside, certain models suggest that if things don't change radically in the near future, you're just not going to be able to do that safely. And so if you value that, and that's part of like what gets you out of bed every morning, and as you see as like making your life meaningful and worth living, then that might disappear if you live long enough. And that's a real threat to desirability of immortality that I don't really see discussed much in the literature. And so I think that in addition to the really great questions that you already brought up, there's like a whole host of other sorts of questions that I think worth pursuing and thinking about, and are directly relevant to the same considerations. Like, should we be pursuing life extending technologies, right? I mean, people are throwing a lot of money at this stuff. There's a lot of interest in this. And, I think that going back to a theme from earlier in our conversation, like philosophers have some interesting stuff to say on these issues. We'll see if the billionaires listen to us.
Yeah, that's good. And I think I saw somewhere that you have a forthcoming article that maybe discusses some of these things, called the like reflections on meaning and immortality or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so that the basic argument that I was giving you about like values and meaning and immortality and stuff, that's more or less worked out in that paper.
Nice. I'll have to check that out when it comes out.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, so I think I'll wrap up with a sort of more general question that I like to ask a lot of the guests here. Actually, we've kind of hinted at some of the answers to this, but what do you think some of the value of philosophy is, both sort of to you, but also to a society, to us in general?
That's a great question. Probably one I should have like a stock answer to that I can spit out right away. But I actually think that's probably something that I get out of philosophy is the freedom to continuously examine stuff that I take for granted. And I think that's really valuable. Okay, so casting a critical gaze on stuff that that operates in the background, that you take for granted, examining your assumptions and things like that, pressing for deeper explanations of things, or trying to understand how things hang together in even wider sense than you had considered before. That's all, I think, central to how I think about philosophy, but also really valuable. Why do I think it's valuable? Well, we had some discussion about politics earlier, and I think that it has some application there. We've also been talking about life planning and things like that, and I think it has application there. It has application even in more narrow contexts. I often talk to my students about how important it's going to be as they move out of their formal schooling and move into whatever sorts of careers they have. Like, if you're just like a robot doing the boss's bidding, first of all, it's not very fun for you, but it's actually like really not good for the organization you work for. Okay, like it might be good for that particular boss because they don't get any flack, but from the organization's perspective, that's going to lead to like no innovation, right? A lot of like stagnant ideas. Like that's just not what employers often want, right? Like they want people who can think for themselves and question things, assumptions that have been made, and try to like improve on the way things work. So I think that's one value. But then also, like, as you mentioned, we talked a lot about another value that I see, which is that, philosophers are trained to critically examine arguments. And so there are many places where you might think that doesn't have application, like near-death experiences. Man, like people say they're floating outside their bodies. What does a philosopher have to say about it? Well, turns out, right, like we want to think they had the experience of floating outside their body, right? And on the basis of that experience, they're drawing some inferences about what actually occurred. And that space between the experience and the inference, that's exactly where the philosophical training is valuable as well. And again, I think it's going to have a wide application to many, many different areas of our life. And so that's another place. And I'm just going to like connected to these things. I'd say, one thing that's super valuable about philosophy, and I hear this from my students all the time, they'll say like, man, this was the first class where I was just like able to, like I was given freedom and license to just think about stuff and discuss it. And I think that like, it sounds maybe a little bit funny and impractical, but it's like super important. We're curious creatures. And part of the value of philosophy is it does, as a discipline, kind of give us license to explore a wide range of questions and think about them in a bunch of different ways, right? And, like that satisfies, I think, like a real part of our human character, this like intellectual curiosity. So it's valuable for that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah, I definitely share a lot of the sentiments you give there. Yeah, so I think we'll draw the questions to an end, and I'll say thank you so much for being here and taking the time to take my questions and provide your thoughtful responses. It's been really great.
Thanks. Yeah, this has been really fun. Thanks. Great questions, and I really appreciate you read some of my stuff and thought about it. So that's amazing. Thank you. Yeah.